In this tutorial, we're going to be going over some tips and tricks for making lips look beautiful. Hi there, Michael Wilshinovich here again from VibrantShot. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/vibrantshot and also at vibrantshot.com. So today we're going to be looking at some tips that you can use for essentially retouching lips. Now, lip retouching is really actually a nightmare. So the best trick I can really give you is to just get it right in camera and make sure that your makeup artist just spends a lot of extra time to make them look as good as possible. Now, sometimes obviously, situations are what they are, and the model might happen to have dry lips that day or whatever it might be, and you have to work on them to make them look a little bit better. So we're going to be using these two sample images here, and I'm going to be showing you some techniques that you can use to refine the lip and also smooth out any cracks in the lips that may exist. So we'll go ahead and get started with this one with a fairly straightforward technique that can get you a really nice result with a minimal amount of effort in very little time. So what we're going to do here, essentially we're going to be using a variation of frequency separation, and this is a trick that you can also use to smooth out hair, but we're going to use it in this case to essentially take some of this texture in the lip and sort of dumb it down and smooth it out. So it's very hard to kind of start retouching lips when there's, you don't really know where to begin. There's a lot of areas that you want to kind of take care of and you want to smooth out. So what we can basically do is just start off with a nice smoothing layer so that we have a good foundation to work off of. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the same steps that we would normally take with frequency separation, which is just going to be to duplicate our layer twice. So you're going to select your bottom layer and hit Command or Control J twice. So now that we've got our duplicates here, we're going to name the first one low, name the top one high, and this is all pretty much the same stuff that you would do with frequency separation, and you may have already seen me do many times over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the high layer and I'm going to select my low layer. And what we have to do now is figure out a good level to blur this at. So I'm going to pull our Gaussian blur filter over here. And what you're going to do is basically slide this until you pretty much lose all of the detail within the texture of the lip. So in this case, this looks like a pretty good level. Now what you have to make sure you select is you select a radius that is divisible by 3. So in this case, 21 is divisible by 3 by 7. So we're gonna stick with that number. Now in your case, depending on how big your image is, how many megapixels your camera is, and also what the proportion of scale is between the mouth and the entire image, you're gonna have to pick a different number here. But again, just make sure it is divisible by 3. So we're gonna click OK there. That's going to blur our image for us. Then we're going to go into our high layer and we're going to go to Image, Apply Image. We're going to select our low layer as our source layer and just blending mode add, scale 2, offset 0, and invert is checked. Now those are obviously the 16-bit figures. The 8-bit figures are a little bit different, and I'll try and put them in the description of this video as well. So we're going to click OK. That's going to apply that for us, and what we're going to do is just select linear light as our blend mode, so essentially that gets us back to exactly where we were before. And then the next thing we're going to do is make a rough selection of our lips. They don't have to be, doesn't have to be terribly accurate, just roughly get around them. Don't select any more than you need to, but also you don't have to be careful about being super accurate there. So something like that will do fine. If you want to apply a feather, that's not a bad idea either. In this case, we're automatically applying a feather of 5 pixels. As you can see, it is slightly feathered there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit Command or Control J with our high layer selected and our selection made around the lips. That's going to duplicate just the lips for us, and I know that looks absolutely terrible. So we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we're going to blur them by 1/3 of our initial radius. So we initially blurred by 21. We want to divide that by 3, so our result is 7. Click OK. And then once that's done, still looking terrible, but we're going to hit Command or Control I, and all of a sudden, boom, looks much better. So as you can see, if we kind of group this together and we toggle on and off, we see that we just kind of smooth everything out and just give us a nice foundation for doing some further retouching off that. So what we can do kind of in addition to that is with the actual copy that we've made here, some areas actually tend to look a little bit worse. If you look at this this layer on its own, so let's just isolate that layer. There we go. we can see that we have these sort of dark spots here, which are kind of aiming to offset different things within the original image. So what we're basically going to do is mask out certain areas. So just throw a layer mask on that new layer that we have there. We're going to select a brush and select a flow rate of around 9 or 10% is fine. And then let's zoom in and brush out certain areas. So for example, if we kind of just toggle this on and off, we can see that this dark spot here was created as a result of this process. So we're just going to make sure black is selected. We're on our layer mask, and we're just going to mask that out a little bit. So there are some areas that just actually will look worse. So you got to kind of go through and see where you don't want to apply it. So basically I'm looking for kind of areas where there's dark spots and just kind of toggling on and off and seeing where we made things worse. So it looks like right there I'm not really helping anything by applying this. So we'll get rid of that. And then what I also want to do is I want to make sure that I mask it out of the middle point in here because we are losing a little bit of shadow. Now we could add that back with some dodging and burning, but I'm just going to make sure to quickly mask that out as well, just because we don't really need this effect applied in there anyways. And that, I think, is a pretty good starting point. So what I typically will do is I'll use this as my initial smoothing, and then I'll do another round of frequency separation on top of that. So another thing I will usually do is knock the opacity of this down to probably around 75–80%, just to bring back a little bit more of that original detail as well. Let's just toggle this on and off, and as you can see, it just gives us a nice point to start our further retouching. So we're going to hit Command-Option-Shift-E or Control-Alt-Shift-E if you're on a PC. That's going to create a stamp visible layer for us. We can delete our old layer now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create yet another round of frequency separation on top of that. So I'm just going to run an action for that so I don't have to go through all those steps again, but it's the same idea. Just duplicate the layer twice, create a low layer, create a high layer, and use Apply Image on the high layer. So it's no changes there. Again, I've got a video on frequency separation, so just take a look at that if you want a little bit more information on it. So what I will typically do from here is a number of different things. We can use our clone stamp tool, select it on the current layer, and we can select our high layer, and we can actually use that to retouch certain areas. So just make sure your flow rate is pretty high with this. And then, you can just kind of go in through here. If there's any cracks that you want to get rid of, we can just touch those up. And it works really nicely because, again, we're not really affecting the toning in that area. We're really just affecting the texture only. So we can just kind of go through there and make some of those touch-ups. And this is generally a fairly tedious process, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just to kind of give you ideas of what you can use to even some of this out. Now, one other thing that you can do in various areas, if you discover, you know what, I like this side better, what we can do is essentially just take this side here and mirror it over to the other side. So that's something that I do every now and then as well, so I'll demonstrate that for you. With our high layer selected, we're just going to grab our lasso tool, and basically I figure I'm going to be covering this area here, so I'm going to pick a similar area on this side. So let's just go ahead and grab something like this here. Now again, I've got a feather here of 5 pixels defined right away, and that's usually a pretty good idea. So we'll just hit Command or Control J to duplicate that. We're going to hit Command or Control T, and then right click and select Flip Horizontal. We're now going to drag that over to here in pretty much sort of the same location as it was on the other side. And then hit Enter to apply that transformation. Hit Command or Control and click on the actual duplicate layer we just created. And then we're going to hit Command Shift I or Control Shift I. That's going to invert our selection for us. And what we're going to do is go down to our high layer and add a layer mask. And essentially what we're just doing there is we're saying, okay, don't apply the high frequency information from this layer. We're going to use this top layer instead. And as you can see, if I turn off the top layer, we're just left with no high frequency information there because we masked it out below. So what we can do now is if we discover, you know what, I like the way that looks, but there's these areas that are missing now, what we can do is just kind of bring back certain areas. So we're going to select our brush, pick white as our foreground color, and we're just going to brush in some of these other areas over here and essentially merge those two textures together. There we are. And as you can see, you can kind of keep doing that over and over again. If we wanted to fill this spot, we can take something from here and just kind of blend that in together. And then we can also smooth out the tones by using our blank layer that's in between. So what you basically will do is you will add a new blank layer in between your low layer and your high frequency layer, and then we can just use frequency separation as we typically would use it with a low flow rate here. Let's just pick something like 2%. Grab a soft brush. So that's hardness at 0. And we're just going to sample colors. So, we're going to, if we want to lighten a particular area, we'll find a lighter color here. It does take a bit of experimentation just because the color changes so abruptly in the lips that you do have to kind of sample multiple times before you run into a color that you're happy with. So it's going to be a lot of undo, a lot of Command Z. And that's basically, just kind of going through and evening out some of the tones, just finding something that works. And there's really, like I said, it's just a very iterative process to just darken up certain areas that you think are too light and lighten up certain areas that you think are too dark. So as you can see, we didn't really do too much there. If we just kept going on that, it would keep going, but just very, very faintly, just kind of evening out the colors there. So again, I would probably keep going on this for a little while, but if we just, again, hit Command Option Shift E or Control Alt Shift E, create another stamp visible layer, delete our frequency separation group, and then just kind of toggle on and off here, we can see where we've come from and where we've gotten to in a relatively short period of time. Now, of course, some other tools that you can use for further retouching lips are your standard healing brush and your clone stamp. So you can do that right on top of the layer. Generally, I prefer to create a new layer on top of that. And if we use, for example, clone stamp, just make sure that current and below is selected. And we can start kind of going through here and refining some of these areas just like so. But again, you have to kind of watch out that you're not messing up the texture and you're blending the colors well. And that's really the tricky part with lips, is that unfortunately there's a lot of varying textures getting mixed together, and it just takes a lot of time until you get something that looks really good. You can also use the healing brush. Again, just make sure that that we're sampling current and below. And if we just shrink down our healing brush here, again, we can kind of just brush through here, and it does usually a pretty good job of blending textures in there. So like I said, you basically just keep creating or keep using all of these same techniques that we covered over and over again until you get to a result that you're fairly happy with. But anyways, zooming out, let's just check one more time here where we are, where we started, and I think that's looking pretty good. And then, of course, one final thing that you can do is just to use dodging and burning to, again, even out those tones. So now that we're done with this particular image here, we're going to move on to this one, and we're going to look at some ways to essentially smooth out or even out the lip line here. So if we want to just create a nice even line around the lips, we're going to look at how we can do that, and also how we can add a little bit of extra shine to the lip. So we're going to start off with the shiny lips, and essentially starting there because it's the easier of the two things we're going to do here. So we're going to create a brand new layer on top of our layer. And now in this case, the lips are actually already fairly shiny because I did apply some work to them to make them shiny. But I'll give you the general process for doing that if they were fairly flat. So we've got our new layer here, and what we're going to do is just create, again, just using our lasso tool, a rough selection around the area of the lips that we're going to be probably adding shine to. And again, just make sure a feather is applied. If you don't have any feather applied, you can just hit Q to bring up the quick mask, and then you can just go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just add a particular amount of blur in there to give it a feather. So let's go ahead and just add an extra 7 pixels for the heck of it. So there we go, there's our selection, and what we're going to basically do is just select white as our foreground color and hit Option Delete or Alt Delete, and that's going to fill that with white. Now obviously that's not looking correct, so there is a little bit more that we have to do. We're going to double click on our layer, and that's going to bring up our blending options here. And what we're basically going to do is just take this slider down until we see more of the actual lip coming through. And once we kind of get to this point here, we're going to hit Option or Alt on our keyboard, and we're going to split this slider over here. And we're basically just going to drag that down until we think it looks okay. So let's say something like that. Okay, and that's still obviously looking a little bit too intense. We don't want it to be quite that much, so we can just take our opacity down. And as you can see, it just adds a little highlight into the lips if you want them to pick up some light. Now, like I said, I've already kind of done this here, so it's not going to look great. It's actually going to give you too much of it. But if you just want to punch up those highlights, it's a nice quick way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer, and we're actually going to look at how we can even out the lip line here. Now, this lip line is actually already pretty good, and if you're going for a more natural look, then this is pretty much where you're going to stay. In our case, I'm going to just slightly enhance this here. So we're going to grab our pen tool, and I'm not going to cover the pen tool in a lot of detail here just because I've already done that in past videos, and there's a lot of videos that are dedicated just to the pen tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and start pen tooling around the lips here, and I'm really just going to be focusing on the top section here because the bottom looks pretty good already. So we're going to start somewhere in and around here, and I'm just going to go around the area that I think I'm going to want to refine. Holding down the Option key, I'm just going to drag my handle down here just to adjust its position. Go into here. And now I'm going to hold actually Command, and I'm just going to move that point because I think it's a little bit too high. There we go. And then probably my next one will end up somewhere in around here. Again, holding down Option to just adjust the shape of that, and again holding Command just to pull this to this side. I think we just need to center that a little bit better. And then we're going to probably run this down to around this area. Again, holding down the Option key and just adjusting this handle. And just going to go around here. Like I said, we don't have to really be accurate at all here because we're not going to be dealing with that area. So just kind of going through here and closing out our selection. So we've got a path, and really we're just going to be using this top part of our path. So we're going to paths, just name this lips so we don't lose our path. If you don't name your path and you start creating a new one, it will override whatever the previous path was. So always name it if you don't want to lose it later. What we can essentially do now is we're going to create 2 layers on top of this. So let's just start with the first layer. I'm going to go into paths. And actually, sorry, we're going to stay back here. With the pen tool selected, with our path selected, we can go up to Selection and apply a feather to that. So I'm probably going to apply somewhere in around 2 pixels to start with. Click OK, and that's just going to give me our selection there. Now for this layer, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to work from the inside out, and I'm going to create another layer where I'm going to work from the outside in. So we're going to grab our clone stamp tool. You can also hit S to bring that up. Select a flow rate of around 30% or so. Again, make sure current and below is selected. And we're just going to zoom in here and start clone stamping. So hold down the Option key and just kind of repeatedly keep sampling. One thing you can also do is just hit Command or Control H just to hide that, that selection if you don't want to see it. And again, this is a fairly iterative process. You have to kind of play around with it a couple of times before it starts to look good. Let's just go back a few steps here, just because it's way too dark. Generally, what you want to do is work as close as possible to your line that you've made with the selection. Otherwise, it just becomes fairly difficult to get something that transitions well. So let's just go through here. And again, you have to kind of sample over and over again to make sure you don't get any repeating patterns here. And don't worry if it doesn't look perfect right away. We're actually going to smooth this out a little bit later as well. Just holding down Command H just to see exactly where my line is. So as you can see, I brought my flow rate down a little bit because it was too high, and it was very difficult to do the color matching at that level. So it just depends on your circumstance, and we're actually going to even this out a little bit more too. So don't worry that it looks actually too sharp right now. Like I said, just make sure you're sampling very close to the actual line. There we are. Okay, so that's our sort of inside line. And what we're going to do is create another layer on top of that, and we're going to go from the outside. So again, just hit Command H to reveal your selection, and then hit Command Shift I to invert it, or Control Shift I if you're on a PC. And now what we're going to work is we're going to make sure we create a new layer, and we're going to clone stamp downward. So again, hit Command H to hide that, and we can just kind of refine the line from up here. So basically just kind of even out those tones here. Again, sampling very close to the edge. Now, where you will typically do this is if you have like a red lipstick and you're going for kind of a vintage look where the lip lines were very sharp, then you'll essentially be doing this and not really refining it because you want that sharp look. Now, in this case, we don't want that. So all we really did here was again just kind of even out that edge. Now, again, I think that is just way too sharp. It looks kind of silly actually. So what we're going to do is again hit Command H to reveal our selection. And I'm going to add a layer mask on top of that. So with that selected, just hold down the layer mask key, and that's going to blur out essentially this area. And now we're going to also add the same thing down here. So just hold down Command and click on that. That'll bring back our selection again. Once again, hitting Command Shift I or Control Shift I because we want to now just select the lips. We don't want everything else selected. And we're going to add a layer mask on top of that. So basically we want two opposite layer masks here. And then what we can do is we can essentially blur these. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and just pick a level of blur that you think looks good. And then we'll probably apply the same level to the outside. And let's just group these together. And what I actually may do then is also take the opacity down slightly. So as you can see, we get a much more even lip line. Now in the case of this photo, I would probably not even do this at all or take the opacity down even more just to give a slight amount of straightening to that lip line. But again, if you were doing something where you have a very tightly defined red lip, that's what you really want to use to make sure that if there's any bleed on that lipstick to even it out from both sides. So that pretty much concludes our discussion of lip retouching, and hope you found it helpful. Ultimately, there are no huge shortcuts to getting to perfect lips. I mean, we talked about that frequency separation trick at the beginning, which gets you to a good starting point, but beyond that, it's really just going in with a clone stamp tool or the healing brush at a very high zoom rate and trying to get things perfect, one small area at a time. Again, the best trick really to perfect lips is to get them as perfect as you can in camera, and you'll save yourself a whole ton of time because it's certainly conceivable to spend an hour or more just retouching lips, again, depending on what scale they're at. So to ensure that you don't miss any of our future tutorials, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel below, and also visit us at vibrantshot.com for more written articles and tutorials. Bye for now.